When I met Ellis, I didn't think much of him. He was just my partner's son, nothing more. A name I'd heard occasionally, a photograph on a dusty shelf in Ruben's study. Ellis is 23, Ruben had told me the night we first spoke seriously about our future together. Smart kid. Floats between ideas like clouds. He's figuring things out. I remember nodding politely, saying something supportive. Ruben and I were newly in love then. Well, newer than new. I was still learning how to keep his routines from clashing with mine, still trying to be what he needed. Mature, grounded, stable. I never asked much about Ellis after that. He lived out of state, working seasonal gigs, forest trail assistant one year, barista in a ski town the next. The kind of life that left no footprint. The kind that didn't require me to prepare. So when Ruben announced one Saturday morning that Ellis was moving in just for a few months until he gets on his feet, I simply smiled and said, "Of course." Felt like the right response. And then I met him. Ellis arrived on a Wednesday. The sun was starting to dip behind the evergreens that lined the property, casting long shadows across the porch. I was elbow-deep in dinner prep, herb butter chicken, rice pilaf, the kind of meal you make when you're trying to impress people who aren't asking to be impressed. The front door creaked open. Ruben's voice called out, "Ellis is here," like it was an afterthought, and I wiped my hands on a towel before turning to greet the stranger. He was standing in the entryway with a backpack slung over one shoulder, a box in his hands, and eyes that stopped me cold. Not because they were blue, though they were. Not because he was handsome, though he was, with high cheekbones and a mess of dark curls he didn't bother to tame. It was the look on his face. He was reading me. Measuring. Ellis set the box down and offered a half smile. "So, you're Odette." I nodded, trying to match his ease. "And you must be the ghost I keep hearing about." He laughed. "Glad to know Dad still tells stories. Mostly the ones that end with 'he'll figure it out eventually.'" "Classic," he said, brushing a curl away from his forehead. Ruben appeared behind him, carrying 2 more boxes and grinning like he hadn't just dropped a storm in the middle of my kitchen. "You two met." "We did," I said smoothly. "He didn't even bite." Ellis raised an eyebrow. "Should I have?" Ruben chuckled, but I was already turning back toward the stove, suddenly very aware of how fast my heart was beating. The next few days passed in a quiet blur of polite adjustments. Ellis unpacked his life in the guest room down the hall and spent most mornings sleeping in, most evenings disappearing into town with old friends. Dinner, he was pleasant, occasionally funny, always guarded. I kept my distance. Mostly. But I noticed things. The way he leaned against door frames with one shoulder, his posture too relaxed for someone unsure of his place. The way he observed people when they weren't looking, as if storing their patterns. The way his voice dipped a note lower when he spoke just to me. It was easy to pretend it was nothing. Until the evening we both reached for the same wine glass. It was after dinner. Ruben had gone to bed early with a headache, and I was loading the dishwasher when Ellis came into the kitchen. He moved toward the cabinet at the same time I did, and for a moment our hands met. He didn't pull away. Not right away. I looked up at him, his eyes already on mine, and in that heartbeat of silence something old and undeniable pressed between us. Something human. Something dangerous. "I've got it," I said too quickly, stepping back. Ellis handed me the glass, his fingers brushing mine for just a second too long. "Sorry." I shook my head. "Don't be." But my voice sounded strange, even to me. Ruben didn't notice. Why would he? He was busy with work and early nights and an aging golden retriever who needed more love than either of us could give. Ellis filled in the silence. He made coffee in the mornings. He took out the trash. He brought me a coat when I left mine on the porch in the rain. One night I found him sitting alone in the backyard, barefoot, staring up at the stars. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked. He looked over his shoulder at me. "Something like that." I sat down beside him, careful to leave enough space that it wouldn't mean anything. "You've been quiet lately." He shrugged. "I don't know. Just thinking." "About?" He hesitated. Then, about how sometimes it feels like everyone expects you to know what you're doing. Even when you don't. I nodded. "You'd be surprised how many of us are faking it." He glanced at me, his smile barely there. "You don't seem like you fake anything." I looked away, suddenly very aware of how warm the night air felt. You don't know me that well. Maybe I want to. I turned to face him, startled by the simplicity of the statement. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't joking. He was just waiting. I stood. You should get some sleep. Yeah, he said softly. Good night, Odette. I walked back inside with my pulse drumming in my ears, already knowing that something had started. And I didn't know how to stop it. There's a kind of awareness that seeps in quietly, like water beneath a closed door. That's how it began with Ellis. Nothing loud, nothing overt. Just the slow realization that I was waiting for the sound of his footsteps on the stairs. That my heart tilted slightly when he said good morning. That I noticed, without meaning to, the exact way his smile tugged at one side first. Till I told myself it was manageable. Harmless. I was just being maternal. Supportive. Friendly. I was Ruben's partner, not some woman teetering on the edge of something reckless. And then came the evening with the photograph. It was late. Ruben was working in his office, the blue glow of his laptop flickering through the cracked door. I had wandered into the living room in search of a book when I saw Ellis, sitting cross-legged on the rug, a half-empty mug beside him, flipping through a stack of old photo albums. He looked up. Did you know your hair was shorter back then? He held up a picture, me and Ruben at a holiday party 3 years ago. I laughed. God, that dress. I never wore it again. You looked good in it, he said too casually. Still do. I paused, the air shifting between us. I knelt beside him, pointing to a different photo. That's your dad at your college graduation, right? He nodded, then studied the image. He looks so proud there. I always wonder if that's how he really felt, or if he just figured out how to perform it. I said nothing. There were cracks in Ruben's parenting. Ellis had hinted at them, but I never pressed. It wasn't my place. Ellis turned another page. A photo of the 3 of us from the week he moved in. Ruben in the center, his arm around me. Ellis just behind us, grinning like he belonged there. I look happy in this, Ellis said, voice quieter. You were. He nodded, but then his gaze drifted to the space between our bodies in the picture. Funny how a camera always captures more than you want it to. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered into the kitchen for tea and found him there again, barefoot, sipping water like the world wasn't spinning too fast. You should be asleep, I said softly. I know, he replied, smiling faintly. Couldn't shut my brain off. We stood there in the low light, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound between us. I think I'm scared of staying still, he said suddenly. When I move, when I drift, no one expects much. But when I stop, you think they'll start asking questions you can't answer, I finished. He looked at me like I'd opened a door no one else had noticed. Exactly. I reached for a glass but misjudged the distance. My fingers brushed his and we both froze. There it was again. That heavy silence. His hand lingered. Warm. Steady. Too steady. I pulled away. I should go to bed. Yeah, he murmured. Me too. But neither of us moved for a moment longer than we should have. Over the next week, the space between us thinned. He started helping more around the house, quiet gestures that felt almost intimate. Folding laundry, setting the table before I asked, brushing crumbs from the counter beside my hand instead of around it. He hovered on the edges of rooms I occupied, never intruding but always there. One morning, I came downstairs to find him already making coffee. Shirtless. Hair damp. He didn't notice me right away, and for a moment I just watched. He had Ruben's jawline, but none of his restraint. When he turned and saw me, he grinned. Morning. Want a cup? I cleared my throat. I'll make mine in a minute. He leaned back against the counter, mug in hand. You always wait until the kitchen's empty. Habit, I said. He tilted his head. Or avoidance? My eyes narrowed slightly. What would I be avoiding, Ellis? His smile faltered just a bit. Nothing. Just noticing patterns. That night, Ruben asked me to come with him to a work dinner. I declined, claiming exhaustion. He didn't protest. He was already half dressed, half distracted. I helped him adjust his tie and kissed his cheek, pretending I didn't notice how his mind had already left the room. Once he was gone, the house exhaled. I curled up on the sofa with a book, trying to lose myself in fiction. I was still there an hour later when Ellis came home, jacket slung over one shoulder, hair windblown. "Date night cancelled?" he asked, dropping his keys into the bowl by the door. He went alone. He raised an eyebrow, then flopped onto the armchair across from me. "Can I stay?" "Free country." He chuckled. "You're always so formal with me. Like you're trying not to cross some invisible line." I closed the book slowly. "Maybe I am." He didn't respond. Just watched me with that calm, steady gaze that made me want to fidget and freeze all at once. After a while, he said, "Sometimes I think we only pretend to be afraid of things because naming them would make them real. And what are you pretending not to be afraid of?" He smiled, but didn't answer. The next evening, Reuben was late again. I was in the kitchen finishing dishes when Ellis came up behind me. Not close enough to touch, but near enough that I felt the air shift. "Do you ever think," he said softly, "that the hardest part of wanting something isn't denying it, it's knowing it might want you back?" I turned, heart thudding. His face was calm, unreadable, but his eyes, those traitorous, aching eyes, told me everything. I didn't speak. Couldn't. Ellis stepped closer. Slowly. Carefully. He didn't touch me. Didn't have to. The air between us was already electric. And then, just before something irreversible might have happened, he smiled gently and stepped back. "Good night, Odette," he said, voice even, and walked away, leaving me with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the sharp, quiet knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. The following days passed in an uneasy rhythm. I thought Ellis would avoid me, that he'd retreat from the moment we hadn't shared but had both undeniably felt. Instead, he was steady, present, no more or less than he had been before. But I wasn't the same. Not anymore. It was in the way I stood a little too still when I heard his footsteps approach. How I took longer in the mornings, waiting until I heard him leave the kitchen before I entered. It was in the way I folded Reuben's shirts with more force than necessary, as though every crisp line might help contain what I was trying not to feel. But feelings have a way of leaking through the cracks. One Sunday, Reuben suggested a family hike, his attempt at bonding. We drove 2 hours north, into the hills that clung to the last shades of green before autumn turned everything brittle. Reuben walked ahead, always a few steps in front, his voice trailing behind him as he narrated facts about the trail, the flora, the altitude. I smiled when appropriate, nodded when expected. But it was Ellis walking beside me, quiet, watchful, who I felt more aware of than anything else. At one point, Reuben turned down a side path to photograph a cluster of rare wildflowers. "Give me a minute," he called. Ellis and I stood alone on the trail. He said nothing at first, just watched the way the wind tugged at the trees above us. Then, without looking at me, he said, "You don't breathe the same when he's around." My heart stilled. What's that supposed to mean? It's like you hold everything in, even your breath. I didn't respond. What could I say? That he was right? That I knew? Ellis finally looked at me. His eyes weren't challenging this time. They were soft, sad. "You don't have to answer. I just noticed things." We didn't speak the rest of the hike. That night I couldn't sleep. Reuben was snoring softly beside me, one arm flung across the bed. I lay still, staring at the ceiling. Every breath felt too loud. Every thought too sharp. Midnight, I gave up. I crept downstairs to make tea and nearly jumped when I saw the kitchen light already on. Ellis was there. Shirtless again. Leaning over the counter, scribbling in a notebook. The light cast golden shadows on his shoulders, his spine a line of tension that told me he hadn't been able to sleep either. He looked up, surprised but not startled. "You too?" I nodded. He didn't speak right away. Just watched me as I reached for the kettle and filled it with water. "You know," he said quietly, "when I was a kid, I used to think love was supposed to feel like gravity. Like something pulling you toward a person without explanation." I turned slowly. "That's poetic." He smiled, a little bitter. "It's also stupid. Gravity doesn't care who it hurts." Kettle began to hiss behind me. Ellis stepped closer, not close enough to touch, but enough to feel. Tell me I'm imagining it, and I'll back off. Tell me you haven't noticed the way this feels, and I'll forget it. I closed my eyes. My hands clenched the edge of the counter. Don't ask me to lie. His breath caught. I felt it. But I didn't open my eyes. I didn't move. I don't want to hurt him, I whispered. I don't either. He stepped back. The moment released its grip. But it didn't let go. The next few days were strained. Not outwardly. Not in any way someone else would see. But the undercurrent of tension ran deep, strong, and quiet. Reuben remained oblivious, busy with meetings and his writing deadlines, his head filled with deadlines and dreams that didn't include me. Ellis kept his distance. But his absence was louder than his presence had ever been. Until one night I found a note on the kitchen table. Went out with Cam. Back late. I stared at it longer than I needed to. I told myself I was relieved. That it was better this way. That distance was good. But when midnight passed, then 1 a.m., and there was still no sound of the front door opening, I found myself pacing. Not because I was worried, I told myself, but because some part of me missed him. Not having him near made the house feel too quiet. The absence left a void I hadn't expected to feel so sharply. When the door finally opened at 1:30, I was still sitting in the living room with a book I hadn't turned a page of in an hour. Ellis stepped inside, jacket slung over one shoulder, eyes tired but alert. You're up, he said, startled. I shrugged, playing it cool. Couldn't sleep. He hesitated at the threshold. Neither could I. I watched him, unsure of what I was allowed to say anymore. I didn't do anything reckless, he added after a pause. If you were wondering. I wasn't, I lied. He smiled faintly, stepping closer. You were. We stood there for a long moment. Him on one side of the room, me on the other. The distance was physical, but the pull between us felt like something that might tear the walls down. I stood, moving toward the stairs. You should sleep. He nodded. You too. The top of the stairs, I paused, turned back. He was still standing there, watching. And for the first time, I wondered if the person I had tried to be all along, the calm, steady woman who played by the rules, was losing her footing. The night that followed was quiet. But something in me had shifted. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending that silence meant safety. Or that distance was enough. It had been almost 2 months since Ellis moved in, and the air in the house had grown heavier with each passing week. Not with tension exactly, but with the weight of everything unsaid. We never spoke of that night in the kitchen. Of gravity. Of what couldn't be named without changing everything. But the silence was never absence. It was pressure. It was waiting. And it finally broke one stormy afternoon in October. Reuben had gone to a weekend conference in New Haven, something to do with his new book and a panel on legacy. He asked if I wanted to join him, but I begged off with a weak excuse about work. He barely blinked. Just kissed my forehead like I was some fragile vase he'd long since stopped admiring and left without looking back. The moment the door clicked behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Ellis came home a few hours later, soaked from the rain. He pulled off his hoodie and shook out his curls in the foyer, tracking water onto the rug. You look like you wrestled a thundercloud, I said, trying to sound amused. He looked up at me from under wet lashes. You should have seen the thundercloud. I laughed. He didn't. Not fully. And the way he looked at me made the laugh die on my lips. What is it? I asked. He hesitated, then shrugged off his shoes and walked into the living room without answering. I followed. He sat down on the couch, elbows on his knees, hands clasped like he was preparing for bad news. Cam told me I should leave, he said quietly. I blinked. Why? He didn't look at me. Because I talk about you too much. The world tilted. Not dramatically, not enough to send things crashing. But just enough that nothing felt level anymore. I think, he continued, still not meeting my eyes, that she's not wrong. I sat slowly in the chair across from him, my voice steady though my pulse was not. Ellis? He finally looked up. I haven't done anything. I wouldn't. I know it's wrong. My throat tightened. You haven't done anything. Neither of us has. But I've thought about it, he said, a bitter smile on his lips. God, have I thought about it? I stood quickly, walking toward the window, needing something to ground me. Rain streaked the glass, and beyond it, the trees bent beneath the wind like they were carrying secrets they couldn't hold anymore. I don't want to hurt your father, I said. I know. And I don't want to be the kind of person who confuses kindness with permission. Ellis's voice came from behind me, soft and steady. You never gave me permission, Odette. I turned slowly. He was standing now. Close. Too close. His voice dropped, low and even. But I gave myself hope. That's on me. I shook my head, breath catching. You're so young. I'm 23, he said. Not a child. And this isn't some passing thing. You know that. I did. God help me, I did. He took a step forward but didn't touch me. I don't want to ruin anything, he said. But pretending nothing's happening hasn't made it go away. I closed my eyes. The rain outside, the ticking of the old wall clock, the way his voice wrapped around me like something I'd waited too long to feel, it all blurred together. Do you want me to leave? He asked, barely above a whisper. I opened my eyes, looked at him. His eyes were filled with something I recognized too well. Not lust, not infatuation, but longing. That impossible, aching kind. And in my chest, something gave way. No, I said. I don't want you to leave. Ellis exhaled sharply, like he'd been holding his breath for days. But we can't stay here, I added quickly, voice firmer now. Not like this. Not waiting for something to break. What do we do? He asked. I don't know, I admitted. He stepped back finally, nodding, his expression unreadable. Okay. And then, like he understood exactly what I meant, he walked past me and up the stairs without another word. The next morning, he was gone. A note sat on the kitchen table. I'll figure it out. I just didn't want to say goodbye in front of the storm. You deserve stillness. E. I read it twice. Then 3 more times. And still the words wouldn't settle. Reuben returned Sunday night. Tired. Distracted. He asked about Ellis, and I told him only what I had to, that Ellis left to spend some time with friends upstate, that he needed space. Reuben nodded absently and said something about boys needing their own timeline. Then he opened a bottle of wine, and we fell back into the kind of silence that fills a room without comfort. But I didn't sleep that night. I sat up, Ellis's note in my hand, the weight of everything we hadn't done heavier than if we had. Weeks passed. Autumn faded. Winter approached. The leaves turned brittle and the light in the house dimmed earlier each day. Reuben and I drifted like shadows in separate corners, polite and practiced. Then, one morning I checked the mailbox and found a letter with no return address. It was short. Odette, I'm okay. I'm not asking anything of you. I just wanted you to know I meant every word. I'm trying to find my way without confusing it with yours. But if ever you look up and find the world doesn't feel quite right without me, I'll still be here. E. I read it once. Then again. And then I cried. For what was, for what almost was, and for what might still find its place in the spaces between time and truth. 'Cause love doesn't always burn like fire. Sometimes it waits. Quiet. Patient. Unshakable. And still.